cherry apple farm. So they might sell their coffee.
If it doesn't turn, that coffee is just going to blacken. All your airflow is going out through that perforation.
And different you might give different attributes to the coffee, different point values.
Hi, my name is Peter Giuliano, and we're going to be talking a little bit about coffee varieties. But before we start talking about varieties of coffee, let's start by talking about another fruit, which is apples. They come in all different shapes and sizes. Now, these are all the same species of fruit. These are all apples, but they're different varieties of apple. So you know different things about apples based on the way they look, the way they're shaped, and you can use that information to buy the right kind of apples for what you want. So for example, this is a Red Delicious, which is red, deep red. It's got this kind of distinctive shape. And you know that when you buy this apple, it's going to be very sweet. It's going to have a particular flavor and a certain texture that's unique to Red Delicious apples. This is a Granny Smith that everybody knows has more acidity, it's tartar, it's better for pies, and it's got this green color and shape. This is a Pink Lady, which is, yet again, different, has its own unique texture, and some might prefer. So we know variety is important in terms of knowing what the taste is going to be like. It's the same deal with coffee. Coffee, just like apples, has different varieties. It may all be the same species of coffee, but it has different varieties which have different properties in terms of flavor and the way it grows, etc. Let's start with a little bit about how biology works. And in fact, a division of biology, a study called taxonomy. Taxonomy is the study of how you name things. So the biological taxonomy works like this: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And then finally, after species comes variety. In coffee, the kingdom of coffee is in the plant kingdom, just like apples, which is Plantae. Next, we have the phylum Angiosperma, the class is Asteridae, the order is Gentianales, the family is Rubiaceae, and finally we get to something that's more specific and recognizable, the genus, which is Coffea. Now, in the genus Coffea, there are dozens of species that are all indigenous to Africa and the Indian Ocean area. But the one that we're most concerned about, and the one that represents almost all of specialty coffee, is the Arabica species. That's one species within the Coffea genus. There's another species in the coffee industry which is called Canephora, which we also call Robusta, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about later. Within the Arabica species, there are different varieties, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Now, when we talk about varieties, it's important to recognize that we're talking about genetic differentiation between different plants. We're not talking about different individuals with exactly the same genetics. We're talking about different individuals that have kind of similar genetic properties. Okay? So this makes the study of varieties not a particularly exact science. There's going to be differences all throughout. But what we're going to do today is talk about the different varieties that exist in coffee, how to tell the difference, and we're going to talk about how they taste and what the impacts can be on flavor. When we talk about Arabica coffee, the species of Arabica coffee, we should talk about where it came from. And its genetic homeland is a very, very important thing when we talk about the different varieties that exist elsewhere. This is a map of Ethiopia, which is where coffee evolved. And you can see on this southeast portion of Ethiopia, there's a big dark circle. And that circle is the area where coffee first evolved naturally. The dotted line that goes diagonally through this map is the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, and that happens to be the place where human beings evolved. So coffee and human beings evolved in kind of the same place, but coffee evolved in that dark circle there in southwest Ethiopia, and that's the only place that Arabica coffee evolved. And there, in that environment, thousands of varieties emerged over time. There's a lot of genetic diversity within all of those coffees that grow there. In ancient times, before we have any historical record, people moved coffee from that forest elsewhere in Ethiopia. So you can see these dotted circles, and those are places where, in prehistory, human beings took coffee from the forest and planted it elsewhere. And these were because people were already drinking coffee, and they already liked the properties of coffee as a fruit, and they wanted to plant it near their homes. So here it's starting, right? The people are bringing coffee from its indigenous homeland and transporting it elsewhere. And when that happens, you're bringing one plant or two plants and planting it elsewhere. And then you have what's called a narrowing of the genetic spectrum. and these varieties start to be established. The green on this map is where coffee is grown today in Ethiopia. And you can see that it's very similar areas to where people grew it in antiquity. This next map is a world map, and it's meant to remind us that coffee didn't stop its expansion when it got to these other places in Ethiopia. Somebody, also before recorded time, took coffee from eastern Ethiopia and brought it across the Red Sea to Yemen. And then later, from Yemen, the Dutch, for example, stole some trees from Yemen, just a few trees, and planted those trees on the island of Java. Somebody else, the Dutch government, took plants from Java and brought them to Europe, gave them as a gift to the King of France, and there, in a greenhouse in France, they established what was called the noble tree. And this was the genetic parent of much of the coffee that we know about today. They took cuttings and seeds from this plant and planted them elsewhere throughout the world, especially in the Indian Ocean on the island of Réunion, which was then called Bourbon, and in Martinique in the New World. And from there, coffee spread throughout Latin America and back to East Africa and all over the world. So the point here is that coffee went from being thousands of varieties in Ethiopia to being just fewer and fewer varieties as they moved around the world. And so as we have it today, there are literally thousands of varieties still in Ethiopia. It's estimated that between 2,000 and 3,000 varieties exist in Ethiopia, both in the wild and cultivated by people. Whereas outside of Ethiopia, we have only a few dozen, and many of those are hybrids of the few varieties that we're taking out of Ethiopia. Now, how do we know what varieties exist? How do we know how a plant is of a particular variety? Because we're talking about genetic differentiation in coffees, we could take the coffee, take a little sample, bring it to a DNA lab, and now analyze the DNA and compare it to other coffees that we know to be of a certain variety, and that way know that they were similar. We could do that, but it's expensive, it's complicated. There's no coffee buyer anywhere that's going to carry around a little DNA lab with them. The way that we actually do it is by using a technique called morphology, which is how the plant looks. We did that with apples. We said, okay, this looks of a certain color, it's got a certain shape, I know that it's a red delicious. This fruit is of a different shape and a different color, therefore I know it's a Granny Smith. That's morphology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the morphology of coffee. The first thing is look at the leaf shape and the leaf color. So for example, on this plant, we can see that the leaves are of a certain distinct shape. They're oval in shape, they've got distinct veins through them, and the new growth is bronze colored, sort of reddish, and it's got that little curlicue at the end of it. Another thing that we can look at is what's called the internodal distance. Plants have distances between what are called nodes. A branch is a node, a leaf is a node, a vein in a leaf is a node, etc., etc. And you can look at the differences between those nodes. The internodal distance is very long. The internodal distance can be very short. So actually, internodal distance is one thing professionals use a lot when they evaluate coffee varieties. The third thing that you can look at is the sort of general plant shape and height. These are two examples of coffees of the same age, and you can see that they're very different in terms of how they look, how they're shaped, and how high they grow. The one on the left is very short, very bushy, has this green sort of splash of color on it. On the right, this other one is tall and sort of spindly and of a deeper color. Finally, we look at the fruit and seed appearance. We can look at the fruits of the coffee tree. So the one on the left here is orange in color. This is an orange Bourbon. It's got these little stripes. The one on the right is bright red, sort of the color of an apple, but it's got little funny looking leaves that come out of the end of the fruit. That is a dead giveaway. That's the only coffee plant that I've ever seen that has those little leaves growing out of the end of it. That gives you a clue as to what the variety is. So let's start by talking about the varieties that exist in Ethiopia. As I told you before, coffees from Ethiopia, the most varieties exist there, literally thousands of varieties, both in the wild and in cultivation in Ethiopia. Most of those are undescribed, meaning that they have sort of casual local names and are cultivated by people just casually. They don't really know what variety it is. They just know that it's the variety that's used in that area. For a coffee buyer going to Ethiopia, it's like going to Coffee Disneyland. There's complete diversity in these things. They're different heights, different shapes, different colors, different appearances. It's crazy. It's tantalizing for most coffee people to go to Ethiopia for the first time. Unfortunately, since they're not very described, I can't tell you very much about them. I can't give you a catalog of these thousands of varieties that there are. All I can tell you is that many of them are certainly a big part of why we love the flavor of Ethiopian coffee. One of the most famous Ethiopian coffees is from a town called Yirgacheffe, and this variety in this picture is one of the varieties that they use in Yirgacheffe. And you can see that the plant is small, the leaves are very sharp, very narrow, they have this sort of graceful look, and they're folded up sort of like boats. This variety doesn't exist in other parts of Sidama, it doesn't exist in Harar, which are other famous coffee places in Ethiopia. They've got their own varieties that they use there. For example, Harar is known for a variety called the Harar Longberry, which has very long shaped seeds. In Yirgacheffe, they've got names like Degu and Wolesho. These are local names describing the local varieties. We could go on and on talking about the different varieties of coffee in Ethiopia, but mostly they don't exist outside of Ethiopia. Only a few examples of these many thousands of varieties have made it out. One of the most famous, of course, is the one that was planted on the Esmeralda farm in Panama and became celebrated for its flavor, which has a very Ethiopian overtone. I'm talking about the variety called Geisha, which is grown on the Peterson's Hacienda Esmeralda. So this is an unusual example of an Ethiopian type grown outside of Ethiopia. We have a general name for the first coffees that made it out of Ethiopia and were planted in Yemen and taken from Yemen to be planted in Java and made their way elsewhere around the world. And that word is typica. This was the first name used to describe coffee variety and comes from the Latin word meaning ordinary. It's just the kind of coffee that's planted everywhere. This is the big kind of general name that we use for all the kind of ordinary coffee that was planted around the world. The coffees that were planted in Java, in Yemen, and brought to the New World by the French. You can always recognize these typicas in the field by something I pointed out before when I was talking about leaf color and leaf shape, which is that the early buds of these leaves, the first leaves that come out, are a bronze color. Typicas tend to also have this sort of pointy, graceful curl at the end of the leaves, and that's part of their characteristic. In one place in Brazil, there was a town called Yirgacheffe, and out of a field of typicas, a new plant emerged that was much larger. It had larger leaves, a larger trunk, and larger fruit, and larger seeds inside that fruit. This was, of course, interesting to the people that grew it because people like big things. So they kept it separate from the rest and started to plant the seeds of that mutant. It was a mutant of the typica stock. That mutant took on the name of the village where the coffee was grown, called Yirgacheffe, and we now recognize that as its own kind of subvariety within the typica family. So Yirgacheffe is a large bean version of typica and a large plant version of typica, but otherwise it looks and tastes very much like typica. Because typica emerged so early and is sort of this old kind of ordinary coffee thing, the variety is planted all over the world and has taken on traditional names in most parts of the world. Many places it's just called Arabigo, which is related to the word Arabica, or it's called Criollo, which means old or original coffee. Other places it takes on the name of its village or town. So Pluma Hidalgo is the name of a town in Mexico, in Oaxaca. San Ramon is the name of the typicas that are grown in Guatemala. San Bernardo. Bergen Dal is the name for the typicas grown in Indonesia. It comes from the Dutch word Berg und Dal, which means mountain and valley. Another local Indonesian word for the same variety is Garundang. Kents and Chikumalgur are the typicas that we have associated with India. Jamaica Blue Mountain and Kona are the typicas that we associate with the islands of Jamaica and Hawaii, respectively. So you can see that the typica strain made its way all throughout the world and has taken on the properties of the places where it was planted. One place that typica was planted was the island that was then called Bourbon, which is now called Réunion, in the Indian Ocean. It's a small little island. It was a French colony, and they took seeds from that noble tree I told you about in France and planted it in Bourbon. There, it kind of mutated into its own different variety. It may have crossed with other local varieties of coffee, or it may have just naturally mutated into a different variety. But whatever happened, it changed dramatically. It became much more productive, and it took on a different shape and sort of character. So if you look at this picture, you can see that the new shoots of Bourbon are bright green. They have this lime color and characteristic. The coffee, as I said, is much more productive, and the plant is much bushier. Because it was much more productive, it was popular, especially in the 19th century. And they began to plant it elsewhere throughout the world, in Brazil, elsewhere in Latin America. It got moved from Brazil to Guatemala, and from there to El Salvador. So Bourbon is the second largest family that emerged outside of Ethiopia after Typica. In Brazil, one of these fields of Bourbon plants, one individual emerged that was different looking. It was shorter, it was much more productive because it was smaller and more compact, and you could plant them closer together, so it was easier to pick and stuff. And so people became attracted to this type of coffee, and it took on its own name after the place where it was first grown, and that name is Caturra. Now, it's interesting. This is a mutation of one gene in the genetic makeup of Bourbon, just one gene, and it controls what I mentioned before, the internodal distance. So the branches grow much closer together on a Caturra plant than they do on a Bourbon. Otherwise, the plants are identical. And this compactness makes it much more efficient to farm and much more productive. So Caturra became very popular as a sort of version of Bourbon that you could plant throughout Latin America. And Caturra is one of the most common kind of old varieties of plants that we see out there in the world today. Other Bourbons that we see out in the world are Tequisic, which is a Bourbon that we associate with El Salvador, Chocolat, which is another name for Bourbon. There's Yellow Bourbon, Orange Bourbon. French Mission is the name of plants taken from the island of Bourbon by the French and brought to East Africa, where it became the parent of many of the Bourbon varieties there. And Pacas, which is another Salvadoran Bourbon. So as you can see, these Bourbons also spread throughout the world, similar to the way that Typicas did. But one thing about Bourbon is they retain this very, very sweet, rich characteristic. The sweetness is actually the name that we have most associated with Bourbons. The largest number of prize-winning coffees over the last decade or so have been of the Bourbon strain. If you ask most coffee buyers, they'll start to wax poetic when they're talking about Bourbon coffees. Certain countries like El Salvador are blessed with being planted with a high percentage of these heirloom Bourbon strains. So we've got the old varieties, Typica and Bourbon, and all the little variations of them. In 1940, a strange thing happened on the island of Timor in Indonesia. There was a field that was growing both some Arabica typicas and some coffees of a different species, what we call Robusta, which is actually Caffea canephora. And these are two species, and normally in biology, species don't mate with each other and don't produce offspring. But in this case, for some reason, the reasons which are still unclear to science, there emerged an individual that had clear characteristics of both Caffea canephora, or Robusta, and the Arabica typica that was growing there. In other words, these two species produced what's called an interspecific hybrid, which is a hybrid of the two species. It's very unusual, and it hadn't happened before, and it hasn't happened in the wild since. So this variety became popular for planting because it had the disease-resistant characteristics of Robusta, and it had some of the good flavor characteristics of the Arabica, especially in Indonesia, where a specific disease called rust emerged. And as other farmers started to hear about this disease-resistant kind of coffee, they started to plant it elsewhere. Timor Hybrid, that hybridization event, happened in the 1940s on the island of Timor. And it was quickly spread throughout the coffee industry. So by the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of Timor hybrids out there being grown. This corresponds with a general decline of coffee quality that we all know about in the 50s and 60s. Early on, it became apparent that there were flavor problems with Timor Hybrid, and they decided to cross it with another plant that was very highly productive. And remember before when I was talking about Caturra, talking about it being low and compact and easy to farm and very productive per hectare of farm. And so we've got the high productivity Caturra and the disease-resistant Timor Hybrid. Let's blend those together and get a very productive and disease-resistant hybrid. And that variety was a mixture of Caturra and Timor, and they called it Catimor. Catimor was then planted all over coffee growing places in the 50s and 60s because it seemed too good to be true. Disease-resistant, highly productive, and therefore really good for coffee farmers. The problem was it still had those persistent flavor problems from the Robusta genes of the plant. So Catimor is sort of a bad word as far as coffee buyers are concerned. Now coffee buyers are trying to differentiate between the different varieties, and especially as the specialty coffee industry emerged and as coffee buyers started to visit coffee farms and focus in on what varieties were being grown, they started to care about being able to differentiate between different varieties. So hybridizing coffee happened very early on. As soon as it became apparent to coffee farmers that there were different varieties and they had different characteristics, they started to mix them together. One place this happened was in Brazil, where they had típicas growing from the first original plantings in Latin America of coffee, and then the new varieties of Bourbon and being planted in Brazil, and they decided to cross those. And the name that they gave to the cross of típica and Bourbon was Mundo Novo, after the Portuguese word meaning new world. So Mundo Novo existed in Brazil. They took Mundo Novo and crossed it with Caturra, that short, highly productive variety, and that became Catuai. Catuai was grown all over Brazil and spread throughout Latin America, and there's many plantings of Catuai throughout Latin America. In East Africa, there was a variety of Bourbon called Tanganyika drought resistant that they crossed with a wild variety from Sudan called Sudan Rimi. And this hybrid got the name SL28 out of an assessment of coffee in the 1920s done by Scott Labs, who just assigned it the number 28. SL28 is probably, as far as coffee aficionados and buyers go, the most cherished of the coffee, one of the most cherished of the coffee varieties for its unique flavor characteristic, a flavor characteristic that's like blackcurrant. Pacamara was another hybrid that was done in El Salvador between this Pacas variety of Bourbon that was grown on a farm owned by the Pacas family and Yirgacheffe, that giant típica that came out of Brazil. So these are the old hybrids. You could call these heirloom varieties of coffee, right? These are people that are farmers that are hybridizing coffee kind of in the context of a coffee farm. After about 1950, two things happen. First of all, you have the Timor Hybrid and the Catimors that have this disease-resistant and high productivity characteristic, and also the emergence of modern hybridization techniques in the lab. We call it the Green Revolution in agriculture, when scientists started to work and try to improve the varieties of agricultural plants and in order to enhance their properties. And in coffee, we had an emphasis on productivity and disease resistance, especially in the 50s and 60s before we started addressing flavor. Nowadays, when plant breeders try to develop new plants, they're more likely to try to incorporate flavor into its properties. But in any case, we have a whole variety of new hybrids. The variety called Colombia, which was developed by the Colombian Coffee Federation. Riru 11, which was developed by the Coffee Research Foundation in Kenya, and includes, as one of its parents, SL28, but also includes some Catimor for disease resistance. Sarchimor was a Catimor variety that was developed in Costa Rica. Ateng was developed in Indonesia and actually named after an Indonesian famous comedian randomly. Icatu, Castillo, also from Colombia. Yirgacheffe 90, which is from the Instituto Hondureño de Café in Honduras. So these are all varieties that were sort of scientifically made and designed for their suitability in terms of agriculture. So now we know a little bit of where coffee varieties come from. Now we're going to taste a few different coffee varieties. This first example of a variety is from Shililcho, which is in Sidama, Ethiopia. And it's a few of the Ethiopian varieties mixed together. And it's got this classic flavor of flowers, more like jasmine or honey, and a citrus characteristic. And these are all varietal characteristics. The next is also an Ethiopian variety, but this one grown outside of Ethiopia. It's a variety called Geisha, which is the name of a town in Ethiopia, and it was grown on a farm in Honduras. But it still retains, because these characteristics are associated with the variety, it still retains a citrus and floral characteristic. So this citrus and floral thing is something that we really associate with the Ethiopian varieties. Next is Mocha. Mocha is one that probably came from Yemen, and therefore is kind of a Typica variety, but was planted elsewhere. This one also grown on a farm, the Caballeros farm in Honduras. And it has a deep, lime, sweet, savory characteristic. The fourth is a Typica grown in Honduras on the farm of Roberto Salazar. This has a kind of a general basic coffee taste. It seems muted next to the Ethiopian varieties, but it has this sort of classic coffee flavor. And that makes sense, right? You know, if it's the Typica coffee, it's kind of a typical coffee flavor. Next is another Typica, this time grown in Kona. And that also has a sort of a classic coffee flavor, very, very similar to Roberto Salazar's coffee. Next is the giant Typica that we call Yirgacheffe, right? From that giant mutation in Brazil. Yirgacheffes tend to have the same Typica flavor, but with a little bit of spicy, peppery note to it, even a bell pepper note, and some savory notes as well. The next is a Typica from Indonesia that we call Bergen Dal, or it's called Garendang in Sumatra. But this is another Typica that has a very nutty, also muted characteristic. So all these Typicas have a kind of a muted, very classic coffee characteristic. The next is a Bourbon grown on Finca Mauritania in El Salvador. And here emerges some more acidity, a citrus characteristic, and lots of sweetness. It really pops next to the Typicas. Next is a French Mission Bourbon. So also a Bourbon, this time coming from East Africa. This one grown in Burundi, which has lots of fruit and a super sweet characteristic. Now we're going to taste some hybrids. The first, called Castillo from Colombia, which has a citrus and tangy note, along with a soft, sweet body. Pacamara is that blend of Yirgacheffe and Pacas Bourbon, has that green pepper note again, in addition to a sweet spiciness. Catuai, that hybrid of Mundo Nuevo and Caturra, has a tomato soup, kind of crisp, but a more general coffee characteristic. Cafe 90, a variety that was developed by the Honduran Institute of Coffee, has a zesty, citrusy, kind of fruity note to it. And then finally, we have SL28, the classic favorite variety, which has deep, rich notes of juice and plum and raspberry, blackcurrant, and one of the greatest varieties that we know. So we now know a little bit more about varieties, where they come from, where they're grown, and what they taste like. Thanks for listening.